Welcome to the Backyard Bounty Podcast from HeritageAcresMarket.com, where we talk about all things backyard poultry, beekeeping, gardening, sustainable living, and more. And now, here's your host, Nicole.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Backyard Bounty. I'm your host, Nicole, and today we are talking with Orion with Forage Colorado, and we're going to talk about introduction to foraging and sustainable and learn about what kind of things that we can forage for and how to forage safely. So, Orion, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So living in Colorado is kind of how I stumbled upon your website. Every fall, I like to go to the mountains and go foraging for some various mushrooms, but something I've only been doing for a few years. So I've found your information, and it's been incredibly helpful. You've got so much information on there, but I guess I'm kind of curious, how did you acquire so much information on foraging, and what's your background on that?
Yeah, so, like you mentioned, getting out in the fall for mushrooms is kind of how I got started as well. I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so very similar habitats, but just south. And when I was about 10, a family friend offered to take my dad and me and my brother out mushroom hunting. I've always been an outdoorsy person, and same with my dad. And so we jumped at the chance to do that, and that sort of hooked us into it. And then that mushroom hunting became, an annual, or a few times a year we would go do that trip. So that's kind of what got me started. And then I moved to Fort Collins to attend CSU, and I studied natural resource management, which sort of brought in the trees and, natural resources and that sort of aspect into, my education. And I kind of lost track of the mushrooming for a little while in college. And then we were on a camping trip, myself and some buddies, and I happened upon some mushrooms that I recognized, and that sort of reignited my interest in that. And since then, it's just become, like a passion that I just seek to learn as much as I can about and teach anyone who's interested about. So I'm all mostly self-taught. I do have some good friends that know more about, some things than I do. And so we ask each other questions and like, oh, hey, I found this plant. Do you know what it is? Oh, hey, I found this mushroom. Do you know what that is? And, I'm always kind of seeking to learn more because there's always more to learn. So having that drive is kind of what keeps me going and keeps me learning more things, and what drives this sort of interest in foraging. And then, the teaching part of it, I started in 2015. I started my website, Forage Colorado, and it was really in an effort to just sort of create a place where I could find like-minded individuals and, a community around foraging. And eventually it sort of morphed into more of an educational resource where I provide information. I write articles and post little things on my Facebook page or Instagram, and offer classes when I have time to do so, which has been fairly limited recently with everything going on this year and my day job. So yeah, that's sort of the background in it.
I don't think that a lot of people, I don't know this, I guess, but I would assume that most people kind of don't really put two and two together of let's go outside and go look for food, Even though I've been an outdoorsy person as well my whole life, I've done a lot of hunting and fishing and everything. It's normal to think of going out and harvesting an animal or something, but going out and looking for plants or mushrooms, I think, is a little bit less common.
I would agree with that, at least in some areas. It's sort of like thing specific, so there's a lot of people who go out for a few species of fall mushrooms, or, in other states, people go out for morels or ramps, which is a wild onion species. There's little things that people know about and do, but the more broad, like just, knowing what's edible around you is less common, but there is a lot of growing interest in it. So that's kind of cool to see.
Yeah. So, the mushrooms are kind of the obvious one. We talked about that a little bit, but what other just kind of types of things in general can people forage for?
Yeah, so, like most things, there's some seasonality to it. In the spring, there's a lot of greens that can be foraged. There's some roots. And then throughout the summer, mushrooms and various greens, and then berries in the later in the summer and fall. And the greens kind of die off later in the spring or early summer. The plants, start to flower, and then the greens can get bitter or tough. So there's some seasonality to it, but there's loads and loads of stuff that's edible out there that is probably growing with your gardens or in your yard or around you every day that people walk by and just don't think twice about, but it's very likely that it's edible.
And so what kinds of things would that be that you mentioned, like in our own yards?
Yeah. So the one that probably everyone thinks about or mentions, even people that have very little foraging information, they've heard that dandelions are edible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. Dandelions are such a ubiquitous plant that I think anyone could recognize them, even if they, have very little experience in foraging or even gardening, just because it's such a common plant. And the edibility is also true. The entire plant is edible. The roots, the greens, the flowers, even the seed heads are edible, but they're not, that wouldn't be my first recommendation.
Sure.
And then the other thing about them is say a lettuce that you'd grow, once it bolts, it's going to be bitter. The same goes for dandelion. You want to get them when, the greens are tender and young and before they flower. They're still bitter. Some people enjoy that bitterness and will eat them raw. I actually prefer cooking a lot of my wild greens because it develops the flavors a little more and it gives you more kind of ability to use them in different ways. Early on in our history, 50 to 100 years ago, potted greens were a really common thing that people ate, which is either boiled or cooked in a little bit of fat, and as a way to get their vegetables and eat greens. And it sort of has fallen out of favor in more recent years, but it's a really good way to eat a lot of wild greens. One, because some of them can have strong flavors that are reduced by this cooking, and two, like I mentioned, it's kind of a fun way to change than just eating a salad. So dandelions are something that I mention as something that everyone is familiar with. There's tons more that grow in yards and gardens that people probably just discard as weeds. For instance, purslane is a common one. That's a great edible plant. Lamb's quarters is another one. Pigweed or amaranth is the same name. That's a really great edible plant. These are all like farmers or gardeners' worst nightmares because they just can take over, but they're actually all really, really good edible plants. And I would be willing to bet that many of your listeners have them in their yards or gardens.
Oh, yes. I can tell you I've pulled handfuls of the purslane and the pigweed out of my gardens and yards.
Yeah. And they're really great. Purslane especially has one of the highest amounts of omega-3s in any plant. Maybe the highest.
I did not know that. You wouldn't think that in a plant. That's interesting. Yeah. So what are some of your favorites?
Oh, I have so many, and I'm always learning more. There's an endless amount of, it seems like an endless amount of stuff to learn. You have your local region of plants, and if you ever manage to learn all of those, then you step outside of your region and there's a whole new population of plants to learn or mushrooms to learn. So it's a tough question to answer. I'm a big fan of the mustard family because I think it's a really interesting plant to forage. There's thousands of different species in it, and they're all edible to some degree. And once you learn some of their traits, they're actually pretty easy to identify. And a lot of them, are super common. And the cool thing about the mustard family is, many people wouldn't think this, but many, many of the plants we eat, from either our gardens or grocery stores are in the mustard family. So for instance, kale, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, bok choy, all those sorts of Brassicaceae plants or cruciferous plants are the mustard family. And there's a ton of wild ones as well. And the cool thing about them is, some are great to eat just raw. Others need to be cooked, like I mentioned. You can harvest the seeds of some in the fall and make your own, mustard sauce, or use it for, if you're fermenting or if you're doing quick pickles. I like to use wild mustard seeds and that sort of thing. And it's sort of, like I mentioned, once you learn them, you can be anywhere and be like, oh, there's a mustard. Oh, there's a mustard. And it's just based off of their flowering pattern, really. They have these little 4-petaled flowers. And then if you look close, they have 6 stamens. 4 are tall and 2 are short. And that's like universal for the mustard family.
So when we're first, getting into foraging and stuff, I imagine it's hard to say, with too much specificity because your expertise is in Colorado and we might have listeners elsewhere. But what are some resources or some ways to be able to safely identify, I mean, especially mushrooms? I'd say that one is probably where this topic comes up quite frequently. But, if somebody wants to go out and look for whatever, what are some of the best ways to be able to positively ID what they're looking for and make sure that what they're finding is, in fact, edible and safe?
There's a handful of ways to go about it. Having someone, like me or someone local to wherever your listeners are that has experience in it. I rarely would call myself an expert in anything because there's always so much more to learn. But I have other people say that I'm an expert. So I guess, if the consensus says that you're an expert, your local expert would be the one to go to, if you can find one. That's sort of one of your best bets because, they've already gone through the process of learning everything and they can give you these little things you wouldn't think about for identifying, whether it's mushrooms or plants. If that's not possible, then books and the internet are your best friends. I always recommend for plants Samuel Thayer's books. They are good for all of North America and they're the best plant foraging books in my opinion. He's based in Wisconsin and he has 3 books and a 4th coming out. And the way that they present the information it makes it really easy to learn. He has fun stories and some suggestions about like how to use things. They're just, in my opinion, the best plant-based book. So I'd highly recommend Samuel Thayer's books if anyone's looking to get plant foraging books. And then mushrooms, it's a little more challenging because there's a lot of reasons why. One, it's regionally, there's a lot of differences. 2, they're a very novel field of study. We really don't know very much about mycology and mushrooms. And we're learning more, daily. So if you're really interested in mushrooms, joining your local mycology or mycological society would be a really good bet. Typically there's one in major cities at least. In Colorado, we have several. The big one in Denver and then Pikes Peak. There's one in Fort Collins near me that's pretty new. I believe there's one on the West Slope, maybe in the Four Corners area. But, your local mycological society would be a really good bet for learning mushrooms. And then if that's not an option, getting online. If you're on Facebook, there's typically going to be a mushroom group within your area that can help you out. And I spend a lot of time helping people identify mushrooms on Facebook because it's also a great way for me to enhance my knowledge and learn new things. So those are kind of, what I recommend as far as resources. And then techniques for learning, I sort of have a method that I've developed that helps me learn new plants or mushrooms to me. Typically what I suggest is picking something either that you see regularly while you're out and taking lots of pictures of it, maybe bringing some home and trying to identify it that way, sort of working back from something you see regularly. Or the opposite, if you get one of these books or you're online, pick something that you know is edible from the books and then try to find that in your local area. And with either method, you'll want to be 100% certain that you have positive ID on what you're trying to identify before you consume it. And this isn't to, create fear. It's just sort of a cautionary thing because there are some deadly species out there that if you eat them, you can die. So, I don't want people just going out and putting plants and mushrooms in their mouths.
No big deal.
Yeah. So there are a few things out there to be aware of, but you don't need to be scared of them. As long as you don't eat it, it won't affect you. You can touch them and look at them and study them, but don't eat anything until you're 100% sure.
Yeah, I thought that was one interesting thing about mushrooms. I think so many people think that if you even touch one of the bad mushrooms that you're just going to keel over dead in the forest. But, in a lot of cases, you shouldn't eat them, especially raw. But I think that there's misinformation on the toxicity level. Again, not that you should eat them in general, but like you said, you can touch them and things.
Yeah, so mycophobia is what people call that, and that's just, a fear of mushrooms. It's really prevalent in North America. It's been getting better over the last few years, but for whatever reason, we have this sort of fear of them. And I don't know if it's because of, something that the media did and that's just stuck around throughout the years or whatever. But, in Europe and places, it's like a cultural like passed through the generations that the whole family goes out and picks mushrooms and eats mushrooms, and we don't have that here. So there's definitely a mycophobia that's present. And to a point, it's good to be cautious, but like I said, as long as you don't eat them, they're not going to hurt you. They're not, waiting out there just to jump in your mouth and kill you. And really, nationwide, we probably only have 5 or 6 deadly, like actual deadly species. There are plenty others that will make you sick for 24 to 48 hours, and if you have a really bad reaction, or if you have some underlying conditions, could potentially be fatal. But only 5 or 6 that are truly, if you eat them, they're going to kill you. And I believe there's only one species of mushroom in the entire world that we know about that is toxic to touch, and they're really rare, and they're more in like Asia and Australia. And I think it's called like the fire coral or something. It's a pretty rare species, and we definitely don't have any dangerous to touch mushrooms in North America. So feel free to pick and take home and study. It's actually really important to harvest a mushroom that you want to learn about, because you need to see the traits on the underside of the mushroom, whether it has gills or pores or tubes on the underside of the cap, how the gills travel down the stem, what it's growing from. It's important to sometimes to cut them open and see if they stain and how they smell. All of these things are crucial to getting positive IDs sometimes. And if you're going to be posting pictures or sending pictures to someone to help you, taking really good pictures and having really good notes is going to increase your chance of success exponentially.
Those are really good tips. So I know that there's a lot of rules, some written and some just kind of cultural, when it comes to, being good sportsmen or sustainable fishermen or what have you. But what are some of the rules for, I would say, sustainability and harvesting? I see some debates occasionally online where somebody goes and cuts all of the mushrooms and takes them all home, and that tends to get some people worked up. So what are some of the rules so that we can harvest sustainably and not deplete the resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for mushrooms, there is a bit of a heated debate about harvesting all versus leaving some, and then additionally cutting versus pulling. And in the end, it doesn't matter. There's been several studies that have shown that the mushrooms aren't affected, whether you cut or pull and whether you take all of them or half of them. The reason is the mushroom is the fruit of the fungal body. So mushrooms fruit from mycelium, which is an underground network of fungal mass that travels, and whether they're mycorrhizal and associate with trees or plants, or maybe they're saprobic and they're decomposing wood or leaves. The main body of the fungus is in the ground, so you're not going to harm it by removing the fruit. It's just like it's very similar to picking an apple or some other fruit from a tree or a plant. There are some differences, but it's similar enough that can be used as a metaphor. And as far as how much to take, that's sort of personal preference. The studies show that it doesn't matter if you take all of them. That's it's totally fine. But if you feel better ethically or morally about leaving a certain percentage or leaving the young ones, go for it. That's a good practice. And in the end, it's kind of all what we're comfortable with ourselves that is going to be best for us. So I typically will just take the best specimens. So, the ones that are in prime eating condition, and I'll leave the older ones or the younger ones that won't make good food. And I think that works for me pretty well. Mushrooms, as they're maturing, they release spores, thousands, millions of spores. And those spores are kind of like the seed. So they can fruit from the mycelium, or the spores can start new mycelium colonies, which then can produce more mushrooms. So picking them and disturbing them is actually beneficial to the fungi. And then as far as plants go, there's a little more nuance to plants. There's a few different things to think about. So one, if you're harvesting foliage, leaves or flowers, you want to leave enough for the plant to sustain itself, enough leaves so that it can continue to photosynthesize. And then flowers eventually do become fruit or seeds. So you'll want to leave a certain amount of those to continue growing the population. When it comes to roots and berries, like we mentioned, berries are fruits, so you can harvest as many as you want pretty sustainably. And roots, that's the one that will kill the plant. Of all of these, if you take the entire top off a plant, it will likely still have enough energy to come back and do okay that year. But if you dig up the root, that's removing it from the population. So unless it's a non-native, invasive, or a noxious weed, I typically won't do much with the roots. We do have some edible native species with large edible roots that are exciting and cool to learn about, but I typically won't harvest those just, because of that principle. But for like the weeds, the invasives, we have some that are fun with edible roots that I'll definitely harvest and make use of. So yeah, kind of all of that to say that it kind of depends on which one you're going to harvest and then, your own personal feelings about it.
Sure. So I'm hesitant to focus too much on very specifically Colorado, just because, again, we have listeners everywhere. But what are some kind of key tips or expert advice, if you will, for people that are wanting to get started? Some kind of suggestions to get them started in the right direction?
Sure. Also, some of those weedy plants I mentioned, those are like everywhere, the purslanes and the lamb's quarters and the pigweeds. So if you aren't in Colorado, don't fret. You definitely have those. So feel free to look those plants up and see if you have them in your garden or your yard. As far as getting started, picking up one of those books I mentioned can be a really good way to kind of kickstart an interest. You read the book, you'll pick out a few plants that you're like, oh, maybe you've seen that before or I've heard of that. And then seeing it and reading about it will sort of stick it into your mind. And then later on down the road, whether it's that afternoon or then, weeks later, you might run into it and be like, hey, I think I remember that plant. Let me go back and get my book and, then I can compare. And just sort of having the drive to learn it and the interest to learn it will lead to gaining knowledge and interest in it. So it's sort of like a self-driving machine, I guess. Once you get into it, put a little bit of effort forth, you'll sort of snowball into more. And you're like, oh, what's this? What's that? Can I eat this? At least in my experience. Once you get into it, it's sort of just, you want to keep learning more and more and more.
So just get out there and just get started, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it can be as simple as, if you're working in your garden and you're weeding and you pull a weed and you're just like, I'm going to learn what this weed is. Or maybe you already know. Maybe you already know that you have purslane in your yard and you didn't know it was edible. Do some research on purslane. It does have a common lookalike that some people can confuse it with that is mildly toxic called prostrate spurge. So you'll want to learn that so that you don't confuse them. They're pretty simple to tell apart, but start learning about the plants that are around you and eventually you'll get to the point where you feel comfortable enough to eat them. And then you'll start adding more on top of that knowledge and it sort of will grow from there. It's a pretty fulfilling hobby to have or a passion to have because, there's a lot of, more recently, I guess, a lot of worry about where food comes from and food availability and supply chain stuff. And having this, the knowledge of where to get or how to get wild foods is kind of it's sort of a comfortable feeling, that, oh, if the apocalypse came, well, maybe I'd survive a little bit longer than everyone. That sort of feeling. But it also kind of creates this connection to, your ancestral and instinctual just behaviors that the hunter-gatherers way before agriculture would do. The people that were nomadic and would go out and hunt for their food and gather their food, and that's how they fed themselves and survived. So there's definitely a connection as you start getting more into this that at least I feel, and I imagine that many people probably associate with in some way.
Yeah, I agree. I really enjoy self-sufficiency, and even though I live in a suburban neighborhood and I only have a handful of chickens and things like that, I really enjoy just learning new things and being able to go out in the woods and go, oh, I know that, and I could eat this, and but just that self-sufficiency I think is very fulfilling.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to describe. It's sort of this it's fulfilling, but there's more to it. There's like a connection with nature and with the land that you gain from being able to harvest food off of it and create meals for your friends and family and yourself. And I'm a big hunter and fisherman as well. And so, we rarely will buy meat. I typically provide all of our meat from hunting or fishing, and adding in the foraging aspect to that it's fulfilling. It feels good to make a meal with a majority of ingredients that you acquired, whether from growing or or foraging or hunting or fishing. There's a different connection to the food when you do it that way.
Mm-hmm. And I would, pretty well assume that it's some of the most nutritious and healthiest food that you're going to eat.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, purslane, really high omegas. There's, stinging nettles is another edible plant that has lots of protein and iron. They're packed with nutrition, nutrients, and they haven't been, grown from the same seed source for years and years. They're not a monoculture that, have bland taste and are just grown to produce as much as they can. It's wild, and it shows that in its flavor and its nutritional content.
And when you mentioned the nettles, it reminded me, I remember seeing recently on your Instagram that you made nettle ice cream. You would think that foraging, the first thing that comes to mind is like maybe being able to make like jams and jellies or things like that from berries, but it doesn't have to be salads all the time. There's certainly some creative ways to use these things. And nettle ice cream, it's not something I ever would have thought of. So I thought that was really, really neat.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was sort of an idea I had because I loved green tea ice cream and or matcha ice cream. And the ground nettles, the nettle powder, has a very similar flavor profile. So I just sort of thought it would be a fun thing to try. But the idea of taking something you forage and making it into food more than just jams or eating, the occasional berries or plants that you're finding it's a disconnect that a lot of foragers, I think, have trouble breaking through. The going from picking a bunch of plants or berries and then turning them into food. And even me, it took a while to sort of break into some more creative things, aside from just like having a salad or making jam. Mm-hmm. That part can take a little bit of research or just experimentation, but it's pretty fun. And once you kind of get through that sort of, oh, this is just like, it's another thing that I can add to my cooking or, my normal routine of making food, and making food from the forage ingredients, instead of treating them as a different thing, like, oh, I have my store-bought stuff and then I have this forage stuff, just it's all food in the end. And so creating those meals from that stuff is something that took me a little while to break through. And I think, from other people talking to other foragers, it's definitely kind of a sticking place for some people. But it's sort of fun, the experimentation and using wild ingredients where you would use store-bought things. It's a fun way to cook, and it's another way of fulfilling this sort of connection to the land and the wild ingredients that you're getting. It's a challenge sometimes, but it's fun.
Sometimes the most challenging things are the most fun.
Yeah, they're not all going to turn out, all of your experiments, if you go out right now and make a dandelion salad, you probably won't be super happy with it unless you like bitter things. But, it takes that experience to really learn these ingredients work in.
Do you have recipes on your website? I thought that you did.
I don't have any recipes on my website. I have some that I occasionally post on my Instagram.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention, or any other suggestions or questions that you'd like me to ask?
I always say if people, Colorado or otherwise, have questions about foraging, feel free to reach out. I'm super responsive to email or my contact page on my website, which is foragecolorado.com. Also, Instagram has been kind of my main social platform this year. I've been trying to post one thing a day, and I only stopped to go archery elk hunting for a week. So definitely jump on my Instagram and send me a message if you have questions or if you need identification help. I really like doing that stuff. So, when people send mushrooms and plants, they're like, hey, what's this? I enjoy trying to solve the problem with them. And if I do know, letting them know.
And I know you're also pretty active on the Forage Colorado Facebook group as well.
Yeah, that's the page for Forage Colorado specifically. And then I also recently started more of a community group called Rocky Mountain Foragers, if people are interested in that. And that's more of a place to discuss things than, my page, where it's not really set up as a group.
Wonderful. And then, of course, we'll put the links to all of those in the description so that people can access you directly there.
Great.
Well, Orion, I really appreciate it. I think this was some really great information, and I know that I will definitely be joining the Rocky Mountain Forager page. I thought I was everywhere that you were, but I found a place I was missing.
Yeah, I just created it a couple months ago. There was some drive. People were like, posting foraging, non-mushroom foraging stuff in some of the mushroom groups. So I was just like, I'm just going to create a group for general foraging, and it's got like 500 people or something. It's been growing slowly. I haven't really pushed it at all.
Hopefully some of the people listening here will join, and then we'll have more than 500.
Yeah, join up and ask lots of questions.
Wonderful. Well, Orion, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for talking to us about foraging.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us for another episode, and we will see you again next week.
Thank you for listening to Backyard Bounty, a podcast by heritageacresmarket.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. If you have a question you'd like us to answer on the show, please email us at ask@heritageacresmarket.com. Also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Heritage Acres Market. All the links mentioned in this podcast will be included in the description. See you again next week.